Life Stories invites you to explore a tale of redemption, love, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. Meet John Roberts, a self-made millionaire who left behind his humble roots in pursuit of success. But one fateful encounter with his estranged mother, Grace, turns his world upside down, forcing him to confront the cost of his ambition. Will John find a way to rebuild what he lost and honor the sacrifices that shaped his life? Stay with us to uncover this emotional journey of self-discovery and forgiveness. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's heartfelt tale. John Roberts ran through the bustling terminal of Los Angeles International Airport, his polished shoes tapping urgently against the tiled floor. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from the weight of the stakes before him. He was late for a flight to New York City, a flight that would take him to a meeting poised to secure the biggest deal of his career. Gate 37. He muttered under his breath, his sharp eyes darting between signs and clusters of travelers. As he rounded a corner, he collided with someone. Papers flew into the air, scattering like autumn leaves, and a small object clattered to the floor. "I'm sorry," John said reflexively, his gaze locked on his watch rather than the person he had bumped into. 4 minutes until boarding. He crouched to help gather the papers, his movements hurried and distracted. "It's all right, sir," came a soft reply. The voice stopped him cold. It wasn't just the words, nor the gentle tone. It was the unmistakable familiarity of it. A voice that belonged to someone whose absence had haunted him for years. John froze, his hand hovering over a piece of paper. Slowly, he raised his head to look at the woman standing before him. She was dressed in a simple airport cleaning uniform, her graying hair pulled back into a tidy bun. Lines of fatigue etched her face. But her eyes, those warm, brown eyes, were unmistakable. They were his mother's eyes. "Mom!" The word escaped his lips before he could stop it. The woman's expression shifted, confusion mingling with polite detachment. "I'm sorry, sir," she asked, tilting her head slightly. John blinked, stunned. It was Grace Miller, his mother. No doubt about it. But she didn't recognize him. How could she? The scrappy boy who had left their trailer park in Tennessee over a decade ago had become unrecognizable, a man in a tailored suit, his hair expertly styled, and his posture radiating authority. The years had transformed him. He stumbled over his words. I thought you were someone else." Grace gave him a kind smile. "It happens," she said, bending down to pick up the scattered papers and the small bottle of pills that had fallen. Her hands trembled slightly, the motion tugging at John's heart in a way he wasn't prepared for. Without thinking, he crouched again, their fingers brushing briefly as they reached for the same paper. For a fleeting moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, the vast distance of time and regret bridging in an instant. "Thank you," Grace said as she stood, her voice gentle but distant. "You're very kind." John stood too, his mind spinning. His mother was right there, a mere arm's length away. Yet a chasm of unspoken words and unresolved guilt loomed between them. What could he say? What should he do? A dozen emotions swirled within him: shock, guilt, longing, and fear. The airport's announcement system crackled to life, snapping him back to reality. Final call for Flight 782 to New York. Boarding at Gate 37. He glanced at the direction Grace had started walking, pushing her cleaning cart as though nothing significant had just happened. Then he looked toward Gate 37, where his future awaited: the meeting, the deal, the empire he had spent his life building. His mother disappeared into the crowd, her figure blending with the sea of hurried travelers. John opened his mouth to call after her, to say something, anything. But no words came. He was paralyzed, torn between two worlds, the past he had abandoned and the future he had fought so hard to create. "Final call for passenger John Roberts," the announcement echoed, jolting him from his trance. Time slowed as he stood there, frozen in place. In one direction lay the culmination of years of relentless ambition. In the other was the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, the woman he had left behind. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, John turned toward the gate. He ran, handed over his ticket, and boarded the plane. Settling into his seat, he stared out the window as the airport receded into the distance, the cityscape shrinking to a blur. Somewhere down below, his mother continued her work, oblivious to the brief and profound encounter they had just shared. John tried to focus on the documents in his lap, pages filled with projections and strategies for the merger. This deal would elevate his company to the next level, cementing his place among the most powerful entrepreneurs in America. But the words on the pages blurred. No matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his thoughts kept drifting back to Grace, her tired face, her trembling hands, and the bottle of pills she had picked up. Questions he had avoided for years surfaced unbidden. Why was she working as a cleaner in an airport? Was she sick? How long had she been living like this? And the most painful question of all, did she still think of him? Did she wonder about the son who had promised to make everything better, only to vanish without a word? The weight of guilt pressed down on him, as heavy and suffocating as the miles between them. He closed his eyes, haunted by the image of Grace's face and the echo of her voice. For years, he had justified his silence with excuses. He was too busy, too focused, too far away. But now, confronted with the reality of his mother's life, those excuses rang hollow. John opened his eyes and looked out at the endless expanse of sky. He had everything he had ever dreamed of: wealth, power, influence. But for the first time, he wondered at what cost. What good was success if it came at the expense of the one person who had believed in him when no one else did? The flight continued, the hours passing in a haze. The meeting and the merger loomed ahead. But John's mind remained tethered to the past, to a childhood filled with struggle and sacrifice, and to a mother who had given her all for a son who had yet to repay her. As the plane began its descent into New York, John adjusted his seat and straightened his tie, trying to pull himself together. There was work to be done, deals to be closed, and a world to conquer. But deep inside, a small, persistent voice whispered that something was missing, something he couldn't ignore much longer. For the first time in years, John Roberts felt lost. And for the first time, he wondered if finding his way back meant starting at the very beginning with Grace. As John Roberts settled into his hotel suite in New York that evening, the luxury of his surroundings felt like a cruel contrast to the memories haunting him. The city skyline outside the window was a testament to his relentless ambition. But all he could see in his mind's eye was a small, weathered trailer parked on a patch of dusty earth in rural Tennessee. That trailer had been home, a modest, cramped space where he and his mother, Grace, had struggled to make ends meet. Grace worked endless hours at the local diner, sometimes pulling double shifts just to keep the electricity on. Despite her exhaustion, she always greeted John with a smile, her love for him shining through the fatigue that lined her face. John remembered sitting at the small kitchen table, doing homework by candlelight when the power had been cut off. Grace would come home, her uniform smelling faintly of coffee and fried food, and set a bag of groceries on the table with a weary grin. "We'll be fine," she'd say, ruffling his hair. "You just focus on those books. You're going to do great things, Johnny." Her unwavering belief in him was the fuel that drove him forward. But it was also a weight he carried. He had promised himself that one day he would repay her for every sacrifice. He would get her out of that trailer, out of that life, and into a world of comfort and security. But as the years went by, the promise was swallowed by his ambitions. At 18, John left for New York City with nothing but a partial scholarship and a suitcase packed with hand-me-downs. Grace had hugged him tightly at the bus station, her tears soaking into his shoulder. "You'll do great things," she whispered. "I know you will." The city had been a shock to his system, its scale, its pace. its unrelenting demands. But John adapted quickly. He worked part-time jobs, attended business school during the day, and studied late into the night. Slowly but surely, he began to climb. Success didn't come easily. There were moments of failure, nights when he went to bed hungry, and days when he doubted himself. But every time he considered giving up, he thought of Grace, working tirelessly back in Tennessee. Her image pushed him forward, reminding him why he couldn't fail. His first big break came in his mid-20s when he landed an internship at a prominent investment firm. From there, he moved quickly through the ranks, impressing his mentors with his sharp mind and unyielding drive. By 30, he had started his own company. By 35, he was one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the country. Magazine covers and television interviews celebrated his meteoric rise, labeling him a visionary entrepreneur. But the higher he climbed, the harder it became to look back. At first, he had called Grace every week, sharing updates about his progress and asking about her life. She always deflected attention away from herself, focusing instead on his successes. "I'm so proud of you," she'd say, her voice brimming with emotion. "You're making all our dreams come true." Over time, the calls grew less frequent. As his responsibilities multiplied, he told himself he was too busy to stay in touch. He sent money instead, wiring her enough to cover bills and a little extra for comfort. Grace never asked for more, but her brief, grateful replies to his transfers became a source of guilt. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. Months turned into years, and though he often thought of her, reaching out seemed impossible. What would he even say? The shame of his silence grew heavier with each passing day. Now, sitting in his plush suite, John stared at the untouched drink on the coffee table and wondered how he had let things spiral so far out of control. Grace didn't deserve his neglect. She had given him everything, and he had repaid her with abandonment. He opened his laptop, intending to distract himself with work, but the sight of the merger documents only deepened his unease. This deal was the culmination of years of effort, a move that would double his company's value and solidify his position as a leader in the industry. Yet, for all its potential, it felt hollow. The face of his mother, tired and aged beyond her years, floated into his thoughts again. She had looked so different at the airport, so fragile. What had happened to the strong, vibrant woman who had held their little family together? Had life worn her down? Or had his absence been the final blow? A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. John's assistant, Claire, entered, carrying a stack of files. "The final projections for tomorrow's meeting," she said, setting them on the table. "Is everything all right? You seem off." John forced a smile. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Claire hesitated. "If there's anything you need, let me know. You've got a lot riding on this deal." "I know," he replied, his tone clipped. "Thanks, Claire. I'll see you in the morning." After she left, John leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The life he had built was everything he had dreamed of. Yet the emptiness inside him was undeniable. For years, he had chased success, believing it would bring him peace. But now, faced with the reality of his mother's life, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been running in the wrong direction. Tomorrow's meeting would define the future of his company. But tonight, John couldn't stop thinking about the past, the promises he had made, the love he had taken for granted, and the mother he had left behind. John lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his hotel room. The hum of the city outside was muffled by the thick windows, but the noise inside his mind was deafening. Images of Grace kept flashing before him, her trembling hands, her weary smile, the pills she had quietly gathered. It was a stark reminder of the life she now led, a life that seemed worlds apart from his own. The memory of her voice at the airport, soft and unfamiliar, twisted in his chest. How had he let this happen? How had he become so consumed by his success that he had forgotten the very person who had made it all possible? Unable to sleep, John sat up and reached for his phone. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the call button. The number was still there, the one he hadn't dialed in years. His heart raced as he considered pressing it. But the fear of what he might hear held him back. What if she didn't want to speak to him? What if it was too late? Instead, he opened a different app and searched for a private investigator. If he couldn't call her, he could at least find out more about her situation. Within minutes, he had sent an inquiry, providing Grace's name and the details he remembered. He added a note emphasizing discretion. The guilt of outsourcing such a personal matter gnawed at him, but he convinced himself it was the best way to start. The next morning, John forced himself to focus on the meeting. The boardroom buzzed with energy as executives reviewed the final details of the merger. It was everything John had worked toward, his chance to solidify his empire and secure his legacy. But as graphs and projections filled the screen, all he could see was Grace's face. John, one of the board members, called out, snapping him back to the present. Your thoughts on the revised proposal? He cleared his throat, buying time to compose himself. The numbers look promising, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Let's proceed as planned. The meeting continued, but John's mind wandered. He barely noticed when the session concluded and his colleagues filed out, congratulating each other on their progress. Alone in the room, he stared at the empty chairs, feeling a growing sense of unease. By the afternoon, the investigator had sent him a preliminary report. John read it on his phone as he rode back to the hotel. The details were sparse but sobering. Grace had been working at the airport for 5 years, earning barely enough to cover her expenses. She lived in a small apartment in a rundown neighborhood in Chicago, a far cry from the life he had imagined for her. The mention of her recent visits to a local clinic sent a chill through him. What kind of health issues was she facing? And why hadn't she reached out to him for help? John stared out the car window as the city blurred past, his chest tightening with every revelation. He thought back to the promises he had made as a boy, vowing to take care of Grace and give her the life she deserved. He had broken every one of them. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a journalist named Emma Carter. She introduced herself as a reporter working on a piece about successful executives and their origins. Your story is particularly intriguing, she wrote. I'd like to discuss it further. John's stomach sank. He knew what this meant. Someone had dug into his past, unearthing the truth he had carefully hidden for years. The timing couldn't have been worse. With the merger on the line, any scandal could jeopardize the deal and his reputation. He considered ignoring the message but decided against it. Fine, he replied curtly. Let's meet tomorrow. My office. Noon. That night, John couldn't bring himself to eat. The weight of the day's revelations pressed heavily on him, and the thought of facing Grace's reality made him feel like an imposter. He had built an empire, earned the respect of his peers, and accumulated more wealth than he had ever dreamed of. Yet, his mother, a woman who had given him everything, was struggling to survive in obscurity. As he paced the room, John's mind reeled with questions. What had kept Grace from reaching out to him all these years? Was she too proud? Too hurt? Or simply resigned to the life she had? And what could he do now to make amends for a decade of absence? At one point, he picked up the phone, dialing the investigator's number. When the man answered, John's voice was tense. I need more details. Medical records. Financial situation, everything. The investigator hesitated. That might take a few days. Mr. Roberts. Then start now. John snapped. I'll pay whatever it takes. When the call ended, he sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The weight of his choices, both past and present, felt suffocating. Success had cost him more than he was willing to admit, and now he was left to face the consequences. Before lying down, John opened his laptop and pulled up an old photo he had scanned years ago. It was a picture of him and Grace, taken in front of their trailer. She was smiling, her arm wrapped protectively around him, and he was grinning with the carefree joy of a boy who believed the world was full of possibilities. Staring at the photo, John felt a wave of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had spent so long running toward success that he had forgotten where he came from and who had made that journey possible. As sleep finally claimed him, one thought lingered in his mind: it wasn't too late. Not yet. John stood in front of a modest apartment building in Chicago, its brick facade weathered by years of neglect. The investigator's report had brought him here, to the address where Grace Miller lived. He stared at the building for a long moment, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. A part of him wanted to turn around and leave, to retreat to the comfortable cocoon of his life in New York. But the image of Grace at the airport, tired and frail, refused to leave his mind. With a deep breath, he walked up the steps and pressed the buzzer for apartment 3B. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. His heart pounded as he rehearsed what he might say. But when a soft voice answered through the intercom, all words fled him. "Hello." Grace's voice crackled through, tinged with weariness but unmistakably hers. "It's John," he said after a pause, his voice trembling. "It's your son." There was silence on the other end, so heavy it felt like the world had stopped. Finally, the door buzzed open, and he stepped inside, his legs shaky with a mix of fear and anticipation. Climbing the narrow staircase, John felt the weight of years pressing down on him. When he reached her door, it opened before he could knock. Grace stood there, her hand on the doorknob, her eyes wide with disbelief. Up close, the changes in her were even more apparent: the deeper lines around her eyes, the streaks of gray in her hair, and the tiredness that seemed to emanate from her very being. Yet, despite everything, she was still his mother. "John," she whispered, as though afraid saying his name too loudly might break the moment. "Hi, Mom," he said softly, a lump rising in his throat. "It's me." Tears filled her eyes as she reached out to touch his face, her fingers trembling. I thought you forgot about me." The words cut through him like a blade. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I never forgot. I didn't know how to come back." Grace pulled him into a hug, her frail arms wrapping tightly around him. For a moment, the years melted away, and they were simply mother and son, reunited after far too long. John buried his face in her shoulder, the scent of her faintly reminding him of home. "Come inside," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. She led him into the small apartment, which was modest but meticulously clean. The furnishings were simple, the walls adorned with a few photos, mostly of John as a boy. He noticed a small stack of letters on the coffee table, all unopened, with his company's logo on them. It dawned on him that she had kept every correspondence he'd sent, even if she hadn't responded. "I didn't know if you wanted me to call," she said, following his gaze to the letters. "I thought maybe you were too busy." John sat down on the worn sofa, his head in his hands. "I was an idiot," he admitted. "I thought sending money was enough, that it could make up for my silence. But it was cowardice. Mom, I was too ashamed to face you." Grace sat beside him, her expression softening. "I never wanted your money, John. All I ever wanted was to know you were okay, that you were happy." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. John looked at her, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not happy, Mom. I haven't been for a long time." Grace reached for his hand, her touch as warm and comforting as he remembered. "Why not, sweetheart?" "Because I left you behind," he said, the confession spilling out of him. "I spent all these years chasing success, trying to prove I was worth something. But what good is it if I can't share it with the person who believed in me when no one else did?" Grace smiled sadly, her eyes glistening with tears. "Oh, John, you've always been worth something. Not because of what you've achieved, but because of who you are. They talked for hours, sharing stories and memories. John listened as Grace recounted the years he had missed, the struggles, the moments of doubt, and the quiet joys that had kept her going. She spoke of the pride she felt every time she heard about his accomplishments, even if they came from a distance. "I always knew you'd do great things," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "But I never stopped hoping you'd find your way back to me." John promised her that he was back for good this time. He vowed to make up for the lost years, to be the son she deserved. Grace simply nodded, her hand resting over his. As the evening wore on, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about deals or deadlines. He wasn't consumed by the need to prove himself. He was just John, Grace's son, and that was enough. Before he left, he paused at the door and turned to her. "I'll be back tomorrow, Mom," he said, his voice steady. "We have a lot to catch up on." Grace smiled, a warmth in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. "I'll be here." As he stepped out into the cool night air, John felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew there was still work to be done, that rebuilding their relationship wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time, he believed it was possible. Walking toward his car, he glanced up at the stars. 4 years. He had measured his success by the heights he could reach. But now, he realized, true success was about the connections he could rebuild and the love he could nurture along the way. The following morning, John stood in his New York office, staring out at the city skyline. The world he had built stretched before him, a testament to years of relentless ambition. Yet, for all its grandeur, it felt hollow. The reunion with Grace had shifted something within him, a profound realization that his empire had been built on shaky foundations. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, turning to see his assistant, Claire, enter with a folder in hand. "Morning, Mr. Roberts," she said, setting the folder on his desk. "The board meeting is in an hour. Final agenda and projections are in here." John nodded, thanking her. As she turned to leave, he stopped her. "Claire, can I ask you something?" She paused, surprised. "Of course. What would you do if you realized the path you've been on for years was the wrong one?" Claire's expression softened. "I'd try to make it right," she said simply, "even if it meant starting over." Her words stayed with him as he prepared for the meeting. By the time he entered the boardroom, his decision was made. The room buzzed with anticipation as the board members and executives settled into their seats. At the head of the table, John looked out at the faces before him, people who had trusted him to lead, who had invested in his vision. He owed them the truth. "Before we begin," he started, his voice steady but firm, "there's something I need to address." The murmurs subsided, and all eyes turned to him. 4 years. I've defined success by growth, profits, and influence. I've built this company on those principles, and it has brought us to where we are today. But in the process, I've lost sight of something far more important." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Yesterday, I reunited with my mother. Many of you don't know this, but I grew up in a trailer park in Tennessee. My mother, Grace, worked tirelessly to provide for me. She gave everything she had to give me a chance at a better life. And in my pursuit of success, I abandoned her." A hush fell over the room as John continued. "I've spent years running from that truth, hiding behind wealth and achievements. But seeing her yesterday reminded me of what truly matters. Success isn't just about what we build, it's about who we build it for." He took a deep breath. "That's why I've decided to cancel the merger." The room erupted in chaos. Board members protested, their voices overlapping in confusion and anger. "John, this merger is worth billions," one of them exclaimed. "You're risking everything we've worked for," another added. John held up a hand, silencing the room. "I understand your concerns, and I don't take this decision lightly. But I believe we have a responsibility to use our resources for something greater than profit. That's why I'm proposing a new initiative, a comprehensive program to support our employees and their families, particularly those in lower income positions. The board members exchanged skeptical glances. One of them leaned forward. And how do you plan to fund this? John met their gaze. Unflinching. By reallocating the resources we would have spent on the merger. I'm willing to take the financial hit personally if it means creating a company that prioritizes people over profit. The room fell silent. It was clear that not everyone supported his decision. But John felt a surge of conviction. For the first time in years, he was choosing a path aligned with his values, not his ambitions. As the meeting concluded, John's assistant approached him. "That was bold," Claire said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "Do you think they'll follow through?" "They don't have to," John replied. "I will." Later that day, he met with Emma Carter, the journalist who had contacted him earlier. She had heard about the cancelled merger and was eager for an explanation. "You're a man of contradictions, Mr. Roberts," she said, her tone equal parts curiosity and skepticism. "One minute, you're the ruthless businessman on every magazine cover. The next, you're tearing down your empire for a cause." John smiled faintly. "I wouldn't say I'm tearing it down. I'm rebuilding it, this time with a foundation that matters." Emma studied him for a moment. "And your mother? What does she think of all this?" "She doesn't know yet," he admitted. "But I plan to tell her tonight." Emma nodded, her pen poised over her notepad. This story could shake up the business world. "Are you ready for the backlash?" "I've faced bigger storms," John said. "And this time, I have something worth fighting for." That evening, he returned to Chicago and took Grace out to dinner at a small, cozy diner. As they sat across from each other, John shared his plans, watching as her expression shifted from surprise to pride. "You've always had a good heart, John," she said, reaching for his hand. "I just think it got buried under all that ambition. I'm glad you found it again." Her words filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he saw his success not as an end but as a means to something greater, a way to honor the sacrifices Grace had made and to create a legacy built on empathy and love. The days that followed were a whirlwind. John's announcement of the cancelled merger had sent shockwaves through the business world. Headlines questioned his motives. Analysts debated the wisdom of his decision. And shareholders expressed their frustration. The company's stock plummeted. And some board members began to threaten their resignation. Amid the chaos, John remained steadfast. His resolve had been tested many times before. But this was different. For once, he wasn't fighting for wealth or recognition. He was fighting for something far more important: his mother, his integrity, and a future that aligned with the values he had long forgotten. One afternoon, as he prepared for another tense meeting with the board, Claire entered his office with a knowing smile. "There's someone here to see you." Before John could ask who, Grace stepped into the room, her eyes lighting up as they met his. She was dressed in a simple but elegant outfit he had bought her during their last visit. And the transformation was striking. She looked healthier, happier, and more at ease. "Mom," John said, his surprise quickly giving way to joy. He crossed the room to hug her. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Grace said, glancing at the stack of papers on his desk. "Not at all," he replied. "You're exactly what I needed today." They sat together, Grace taking in the grand view of the city from his office. "This is some view," she said with a chuckle. "You've come a long way from that old trailer." John smiled, though the memory of that trailer was no longer a source of shame but a reminder of their resilience. "I wouldn't be here without you." They talked for a while, and Grace shared how proud she was of his decision to focus on the well-being of others. "You're not just changing your company, John," she said. "You're setting an example. People will notice." Her words filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. "I hope so, Mom. I really do." That evening, John hosted a dinner at his home, inviting Grace, Claire, and a small group of close friends and allies, including Emma Carter and Tom, a childhood friend he had recently reconnected with. The house, though far smaller than his former penthouse, was warm and inviting, a reflection of the man John was becoming. As they sat around the table, the conversation turned to John's new initiative, which he had named the Grace Foundation in honor of his mother. Its mission was simple but ambitious: to support underprivileged families, provide access to education, and create sustainable opportunities for low-income workers. "Why Grace?" Tom asked, a teasing glint in his eye. John glanced at his mother, his expression soft. "Because she taught me everything that matters: strength, kindness, and the importance of giving more than you take." The room fell quiet as Grace dabbed at her eyes, overwhelmed by the tribute. "You're too kind," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't do anything special. You gave everything." "Mom," John replied, "that's more than special. It's extraordinary." After dinner, Emma lingered as the other guests left. "You know," she said, leaning against the kitchen counter, "when I started writing this story, I thought it was about a corporate scandal. But it's not. It's about redemption. About finding your way back to what matters." John nodded, his gaze distant. "That's what I'm trying to do." "You've done more than try," Emma said, her tone softening. "You've changed." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken weight of their connection filling the room. Finally, Emma broke the moment with a smile. "So, when does the Grace Foundation officially launch?" "Next month," John replied. "We're holding a fundraiser to kick it off. You should come." "I wouldn't miss it," Emma said, her smile widening. The weeks leading up to the launch were some of the busiest of John's life. But for once, the work didn't feel burdensome. He threw himself into the foundation's planning, ensuring that every detail reflected his vision for a better future. Grace was involved every step of the way, offering her wisdom and encouragement. The fundraiser was held in a modest venue, a stark contrast to the grandiose events John used to host. Yet, the atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of hope and purpose. Guests mingled, shared stories, and pledged their support for the foundation's initiatives. When John took the stage to deliver his speech, he looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude. Grace sat in the front row, her smile radiating pride. "Tonight is about more than launching a foundation," John began. "It's about acknowledging the sacrifices that so many people make to give their families a better life. It's about honoring the values that truly matter: kindness, empathy, and the courage to do what's right." He paused, his eyes meeting Grace's. "This foundation is named after my mother, Grace Miller, who taught me those values every single day. And it's because of her that I'm standing here now, determined to use what I've built to make a difference." The room erupted in applause as Grace rose to her feet, tears streaming down her face. John stepped off the stage and embraced her, the moment a culmination of everything they had endured and overcome. As the evening wound down, John and Grace stood together, watching as the guests left. "You did good, John," Grace said, her voice filled with pride. "I hope you know that." "I had a good teacher," he replied, smiling. For the first time in years, John felt at peace. His empire might look different now, but it was built on something far stronger than wealth or power. It was built on love, redemption, and the unshakable bond between a mother and her son. As the night drew to a close, John and Grace stood side by side, gazing at the stars outside the venue. The fundraiser had been a success, but the real triumph lay in the journey that had brought them here, a journey of redemption, love, and finding purpose beyond wealth. "Thank you for never giving up on me, Mom," John said, his voice soft but steady. Grace smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I never doubted you'd find your way, John." Their bond, once fractured by years of silence, had been rebuilt stronger than ever. The Grace Foundation was more than a charity, it was a testament to the lessons John had learned, and a promise to honor the sacrifices of those who give everything for their loved ones. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and love, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartwarming tales. See you in the next video.